When will Zion Williamson play next? We have a bunch of injury updates for the Pelicans here. Plus, I'll tell you why the Pelicans won't tank yet. It's the Thursday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Thursday, a game day for the Pelicans as they hope to get back to winning games against, winning ways and games against the Phoenix Suns. Might have a good chance. We'll touch on it briefly in the third segment of today's show. But we've got injury updates. When are we going to see Zion Williamson and others play next? And we've got some good news and some medium to bad news that we'll look at. Plus, I want to get into why the Pelicans won't start tanking yet. And then we'll look at if they do want to try and start winning, the turnaround needs to start on defense, and I'll explain why in one particular area. There's a stat that will surprise you. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen. Today and every day, we're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and available on YouTube as well. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's get into the news you want to hear. When are the Pelicans players going to play again? When is Zion Williamson going to play again? What about Brandon Ingram? We have updates on everyone, but let's start with Zion because that's kind of the most interesting one here. The Pelicans sent out some medical updates yesterday. They said Zion Williamson left hamstring strain is progressing well through rehabilitation and will be re-examined in approximately 2 weeks. They literally sent this out with 5 players, which is kind of nuts. This is the age-old joke of 2 weeks away from being 2 weeks away, essentially. The hamstring injury occurred against Cleveland. That was basically exactly 4 weeks ago. They did not put out any sort of official timeline for Zion Williamson. Shams Charania put out an unofficial timeline of 4 to 6 weeks. So in theory, he's still kind of in that. You know, for a hamstring strain that does take 4 to 6 weeks, Jose's was listed as 4 to 6 weeks. So let's go off that, even though they're not the same person and comparing them isn't really the most accurate thing to do. It is, 4 to 6 weeks. So honestly, he's kind of in that time frame right now when it comes to all of these injuries. So nothing truly new to report. You've seen him start to do some light work around the team in practices at the facility. It sounds like he's taking it seriously from what I've been told. They hasn't been able to do as much as you'd like. He tried doing, it sounds like there were some reported injections and things like that don't have confirmed, but if he did, that usually requires like a week or so of not doing anything for those to take hold. Shams Charania also reported yesterday, the same day that this went out, that Zion Williamson is nowhere close, and maybe a month out. That tracks. If you get 2 more weeks, that puts him at 6 weeks, and then 2 weeks from that puts you at 8 weeks. So that's about, another 4 weeks here, and that puts you at the beginning of January, so a month. Yeah, it seems like if Zion's going to come back and play, it'll be in January, and he's hinted at that himself, that seems like it's going to be the timeline for his return. So maybe we'll get to see this team at full strength. Get to see this team at full strength is important. That's something we'll talk about next on why you won't see this team tank just yet. There's plenty of time to do so, and trust me, I think they will end up doing that. So that's kind of the update on Zion Williamson. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you think he ends up playing in January? Do you think this lags, beyond that? We don't see him till mid-January, late January, February, something like that. Jose Alvarado, left hamstring strain, is progressing well through rehabilitation and will be reevaluated in approximately 2 weeks, so no real update there. Jordan Hawkins has been diagnosed with a lumbar spine annular fissure. I'm not a doctor. And he will be reevaluated in approximately 1 week. I Googled what that is, and it's basically a small tear on kind of a disc, I think, is what it truly sounds like. So that sounds painful. It's a tear in the outer layer of a spinal disc that can cause lower back pain. He's been dealing with this for a while. I think getting some more imaging done on him maybe looked at that. So it's that tearing of the outer layer of a disc. That can be painful. These can heal by themselves basically with just rest. So that's why he's being ruled out. That makes a lot of sense here. The two other interesting ones are Brandon Ingram and Herb Jones. Brandon Ingram, instead of it being a calf strain, they're calling it right plantaris tendinitis. Went through a full practice today and will be listed as questionable for tonight's game against the Phoenix Suns. Herb Jones, right shoulder strain, went through a full practice today and will be listed as questionable for tonight's game against the Phoenix Suns. Those are good. It sounds like both those guys are basically back and ready to play. We saw Brandon Ingram go through a very intense and serious warm-up before the Atlanta game. Herb Jones has been inching closer to get back on the court as well. Recently just had his jersey retired by his high school, which was really cool to see, and all the support from the Pelicans there. Basically, they're getting some dudes back, and that's an important thing. You know, a starting lineup of DeJounte Murray, CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, Herb Jones, and Yves Missi. Trey Murphy maybe is in there somewhere. That's a real starting lineup. That's like an actual NBA starting lineup, in my opinion, and we haven't really seen a ton of that yet. So while they are losing games despite getting some of their players back, Brandon Ingram right now is the most important guy to get back. Herb Jones, you could argue, unlocks the defense a whole lot more. Getting him back is going to be really important. This team's starting to get healthy. After Ingram and Herb come back, Hawkins comes back in a week or two, and you're really just left with Zion and Jose Alvarado. Now, I say just as if those aren't two really important players for the team. They are, but at least you have some semblance of a squad that should be able to compete. Should be able to compete. Doesn't mean they will. They should have been able to be competing right now, and they haven't been. So there's something to be said for that. But now we're going to start to get a sense of who this team is. They're not as bad as the record indicates because of all the injuries. They're better than 4-18 in terms of talent on this roster. Now you've actually got to put it together. This is when excuses, say for Willie Green, oh, look at all the injuries and all that, start to run out. You got dudes back. You got to play better. You got to be motivated. You've got to go out and you've got to win some games if he wants to even remotely try and keep his job going into next season. And I don't expect any sort of move during the season, but I do think you could move on after the season if you go, well, when we were healthy, they still didn't play well. They still didn't win. And then it does look like he's getting done dirty there or something along those lines. So New Orleans is probably going to get better than their 4-18 record. That's an 18.2 winning percentage. Pretty rough here. It's second worst in the league right now. Is that a good thing? Do we want them to tank though so they get a better chance at, the number one overall pick, getting Cooper flag, SAG for flag, capture the flag, whatever little cute hashtag you're using? Let's get into that because I think it's fine if they start winning some games soon, and I'll explain why. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Chime. We've all been there, spending more than we should during the holidays. So take control of your finances by using a Chime checking account with features like no monthly or maintenance fees, fee-free overdraft up to $200, or getting paid up to 2 days early with direct deposit. Learn more at chime.com/NBA. Getting your finances in order is one of the most important things you can do, and the earlier you do that in your life, the better. You don't want to be just trying to play catch up. So join millions of Chime members who are working on their financial progress. Chime helps with fee-free overdraft up to $200. Your next direct deposit is applied to your balance. Get spotted on debit card purchases and cash withdrawals, no monthly maintenance fees, or any sort of fees like that. And you have over 50,000 fee-free ATMs. Sorry, it's no monthly fees or maintenance fees. And they have over 50,000 fee-free ATMs here. So here's how it works, really. You just set up direct deposit into your Chime account, and after a qualifying direct deposit of $200 or more, Chime will notify you to enroll in SpotMe. And with an activated debit card, Chime will spot you $200 on debit card purchases and cash withdrawals, and your next direct deposit is applied to your negative balance, and Chime never charges overdraft fees for using SpotMe. They're not going to nickel and dime you. So enjoy the holidays while keeping your financial goals on track with Chime. Open your account in 2 minutes at chime.com/NBA. That's chime.com/NBA. Feels like progress with Chime. Banking services and debit card provided by the Bancorp Bank NA or Stride Bank NA, members FDIC. SpotMe eligibility requirements and overdraft limits apply. Direct deposit timing depends on submission of payment file. Boosts are available to eligible Chime members enrolled in SpotMe and are subject to monthly limits. Fees apply at out-of-network ATMs or for OTC withdrawals. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now go to LockedOnDaily.com and sign up for the all-new free Locked On Pelicans newsletter in your inbox Monday through Friday, breaking down everything you want to know about this team and the league too. It's one stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at LockedOnDaily.com. That's LockedOnDaily.com, and start your day with the all-new free Locked On Pelicans newsletter. So quick note before we get into the tanking part of today's show here. The Pelicans have a schedule update too. Now that they are eliminated from the NBA Cup, not making the quarterfinals, they're eliminated after the completion of group play. 2 games get added to the schedule. And so you saw, if you looked at it, just kind of a blank spot, like, oh, they have like 10 days off. They don't. Pelicans will host the Sacramento Kings on Thursday, December 12th at the Smoothie King Center, 7 p.m. Central tip-off. And then they're going to face the Indiana Pacers in Indiana on December 15th. And that game is scheduled for 4 p.m. Central on a Sunday little afternoon matinee game right there. Both games on Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network and will be streamed on Pelicans Plus. Games are also on the radio over at WWL. So let's get into the tanking discussion. This team is essentially out of contention. If you look anywhere for their chances to make the playoffs, and it's like 2% or less, it's a long shot just to get to the 10th seed. They're in that big of a hole right now when it comes to the actual standings. And since they don't have Zion or Jose or some of these other guys back yet, it's still even more of a climb. We already did this show where I told you if they played 400 through the end of the year, so not even a winning record during that time, they would need to win about 75% of their games come January 1. And that was like just to get the 10th seed. Even healthy right now with the way this team has looked, they don't look like they're going to win 3 out of 4 games. And they haven't even reached that 400 mark since we did that show, meaning that 75% is even higher given where they are right now. They're 4-18. It's 18.2%. Right now, they are 7.5 games back of the 10th seed. If they wanted to get the 10th seed, they need to pass Utah, Portland, Sacramento, Minnesota, and the San Antonio Spurs. That's 5 teams, including at least 2 of those in the Timberwolves and Sacramento Kings that want to be competitive, want to try and win games. This is not conducive for getting into the postseason. You know, if all of those other teams were like, we want to be bad, we want to tank like Utah will, like Portland will later, like we still don't know about the San Antonio Spurs, that would be one thing. But not all of those teams doing it. San Antonio might want to win games and just get in and give Wemby a taste of that too. So you might have 3 teams also trying that are in a significantly better position than New Orleans is. They don't need to win as many of their games. So that presents a problem here, and it just feels like, yeah, tank, the season's lost. Like that's kind of where we are as I'm recording this on December 4th, and it sucks. We don't want to be looking at the draft and all of that right now. We're not going to get there just yet. So they should just tank. That's kind of in their best interest. If you're an everydayer, you've long heard me say this. If you're a recent listener, appreciate you tuning in, you heard me say this a week or so ago, that the worst spot that you can be in is probably that like middle ground of the NBA, that 11th, 12th, 13th seed where you're not in the postseason, but you are not getting a top draft pick. And look, in the top 5 is predominantly where like the real top end talent comes into the NBA. Top 5 is where you have a best chance of picking an all-NBA guy, an all-star, compared to any other spot. Yes, there are outliers, certainly, but really that's where you want to be picking and you have the best chance of getting a game-changing player. So New Orleans should go after that, right? And the answer is not yet. So one, they're not going to do it yet. It's kind of as simple as that. But I also don't think they need to. You know, they're not going to go through a full reboot. You could argue that they should. We will even talk about what that would look like. But they're not going to go through a full reboot where you trade Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson. And reports are coming out I don't know who to credit because I don't know where it was, but I saw it briefly, that they're committed to building around Zion Williamson, and that's the guy of the future, and they're going to do that. And it just kind of means Brandon Ingram is on the outside looking in, which has been the case for a while now. So if they're going to still build around Zion Williamson, again, we don't need to argue whether they should or not. That's a separate show. That's a separate discussion. Let's just take that for a fact here. That's what they're going to do. They still need to figure out who works around him. Is it a point guard like DeJounte Murray? Is it Brandon Ingram? Is it CJ? Is it Trey? Is it Herb? Who's going to fit around him and who's part of your team going forward for a roster that's going to look very different next season? And to figure that out, you got to win games. You got to try and compete. You got to put everyone out there on the court. The only way this team's going to outright tank is by shutting guys down and having them out due to injury. So they're going to try and compete. They're going to probably go into January and be like, yeah, everyone's healthy now. Like, let's go. Pedal to the metal. Foot on the gas. And it won't get them into the playoffs. And it might actively somewhat, hurt their draft stock a little bit. But it does help you a little bit in the future, too, of, okay, look, Zion and B.I. figured it out this year. Look at that run we had in January and February before people got hurt and we shut them down. That's important. It means we can trade CJ and let him walk, and we'll give Ingram an extension. Or it's, hey, DeJounte Murray can really fit in with this team, and he's definitely a core guy going forward. It's figuring that out. Oh, Zion and Misi really mesh well, or they don't. That changes your roster building for the future. So those are important things to figure out, and that's why they won't tank yet. The other reason is the lottery odds are flattened. You, at this point now, have a chance to be the fourth spot and have an equal chance of getting basically the number 1 overall pick or a top 4 pick, something along those lines. With the way they flatten those lottery odds is the worst 3 teams. So right now, Washington, New Orleans, and Utah all have a 14% chance at the number 1 overall pick. They all have a 52.1% chance at a top 4 pick. The furthest you can drop in the NBA draft in the lottery is only 3 spots because you're only doing a lottery for those top 3. It's not for the 4th spot or anything like that. So it would take 3 teams behind you jumping up. If that were to happen, New Orleans would be picking 5th right now. They're still going to be in a good spot with the 5th overall pick, even if it's not the number 1 or 2 pick. So with those lottery odds being flattened, you can just finish with a top 3 worst record, and you should be okay for the most part. And that's why I think this is kind of important, that you can tank later and still be in a really good position to improve. And I'm not going to point to the year they won the Zion draft lottery. I'm not going to point to Atlanta last year jumping up or any of those outliers, because those are statistical outliers. It's just figure out what you have, and then you can pivot to tanking and you'll be just fine. So I don't think you need to tank right now. There is no difference essentially between, say they don't win a game the rest of the season. Go 4 in, what is that? There's 82 games. 4 and 78, which would be brutal. You don't need to do that. There's no difference between 4 and 78 and, 15 and what, I'm not going to do the math right now, whatever that comes to. It'll be okay. That's still going to guarantee you, a top 3 record in the league, bottom, there we go. Bottom 3 record in the league, bottom 4 record in the league, and that's going to put you in a good position to try and jump up, and your odds are virtually identical at that point in time. So winning a couple of extra games, frankly, is going to be good for the team for long-term evaluation, and they don't need to pivot to tanking outright just yet. They'll be able to do that. And it's also going to help that they're not going to win a bunch of games right now. So in January, February, yeah, you can go on a little bit of a run, and it's not going to really fundamentally make any sort of difference on this season, but that could give you enough data to know what you need to do in the offseason and, for whoever's in charge, and still have basically the same draft picks, right? That's better than the same, the same exact draft pick, but no data. Get both of them if you can. I think the Pelicans are in position to do something along those lines. So that's why they're not going to tank just yet. They want to kind of see what this team looks like. It was much hype. We believed in it. They look like they could potentially be out of the play-in tournament. You at least want to see what you got there, even if it's not going to change anything, and it won't, on the total outcome at the end of the regular season. So coming up next, if they do want to start winning some games, where does it start? And there's a stat that really jumped out at me, and then I did some digging. This is going to share some insight into how I sometimes plan these shows and all that. This is going to be an interesting segment, I think, that's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to get in on all the NFL and NBA action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you can do that over at FanDuel.com. Look, the lines are always updating, so if you realize a team has momentum or New Orleans is going to run out of steam in the second half, get in on those updated spreads, those updated lines, and take advantage. And you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet, and that's over at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen, Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson making sense of everything black and gold and what this Saints team is going through. Who is going to be the head coach next year? What's going on with the Taysom Hill injury? All of those things. He's making sense of it all. Looking at the offensive coordinator situation. Clint Kubiak earned that job. What could that look like next season? That's Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's wrap up the show looking at this. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into how I kind of plan the show and things I look at. Sometimes when I'm looking for things to talk about, and in a season like this, it can be difficult at times. But I'm a pro. I know what I'm doing here. One of the things I like to do is go, what's a stat that the Pelicans are really good at or really bad at? And then why are they good or bad at that? And kind of see what comes out from that. That might, match up with eye tests of things we've seen. And it's like, oh yeah, the stats back that up. Or it might lead to an interesting thing that I hadn't noticed in games before. And it's kind of a mix of things here that I find to be kind of interesting. So when I went to Basketball Dash Reference, one of the things that jumped out at me this year was Pelicans do a good job of not fouling. They do a really good job of not fouling, and thus opponents don't get to the free throw line against them. They're fifth best when it comes to not fouling in terms of fewest fouls per game. They're actually number 2 when it comes to free throws allowed per game. They don't allow a lot of free throws because, well, they don't foul. So why is that? Right? Oh my God, that seems good, doesn't it? No, this is one of those stats that's really misleading and interesting. And as you start to think about it, it kind of comes into the picture a little bit more here. They don't foul, so they don't let people go to the line, and that's because they're just really bad on defense this year. There's zero resistance. They're not even trying to contest some shots. They're not really trying to press the point of attack where it's like, I gambled on a steal and I got fouled instead. No, their defensive rating is 28 out of 30. They're just giving people a free, run at the rim here and don't have a lot of rim protection. So while those stats seem good, and in a sense they are, when you look at everything else, no, it's not very good, is it? And that's what I find kind of interesting about this. And that's where this is kind of like fun to look at things when it comes to all of that. Let me pull up some of the defensive numbers here. The Pelicans give up the most shots at the rim in terms of frequency. They're giving up 39% of all opponent shots are at the rim. That is last in the league. The league average is 32.8. In terms of accuracy there, opponents scoring at the rim against them, they're a little bit better. They're only 23rd, but teams are basically shooting 68% and they're allowing them in there. They ain't contesting things. They ain't fouling things. It's just those guys, it's opponents making shots against this team. Simple as that. So those stats can be misleading, and I think it's important to put those in context at times. And I thought that was just kind of interesting to see. This ties into why their defense isn't good. They're just not putting pressure on opponents. They have thrived in years past under Willie Green at forcing turnovers. They're not doing that this year. They're 17th in the league when it comes to trying to force turnovers, an opponent turnover percentage. They're not doing a good job of forcing those whatsoever. Now, look, they've been without DeJounte Murray for most of the season. They've been out without Herb Jones for most of the season. That's their 2 best defenders. So this makes sense, but if they're going to start to turn some things around, it's going to need to start on the defensive side of the ball. And before you go, wait, no, offense is their issue. This ties into that. If you're a longtime listener or you really started listening last season where I started hammering this point, offense and defense are connected. They are very much connected in the NBA. It's more akin to soccer than it is to football, NFL. So you look at this and go, okay, well, if they can force turnovers, your opponent doesn't get the opportunity to score, and now you're running in the fast break and scoring easily and getting those easy points. And New Orleans needs that. That's where they've been their best and where they thrive is in transition. If you remember, we did a show on this just the other day talking about the transition defense and how that has, been hurting New Orleans because teams score better in transition than they do almost any other way. So they need to be getting out and running in transition, and it's just getting easy points. Thus, your offense is significantly boosted up. But it's good. So if they're going to have a turnaround, if they're going to go on a stretch when they win games and look good, it's going to start with the defensive side of the ball of getting stops by forcing turnovers and getting out and running. Not something that New Orleans is doing a very good job of right now. So this is their defense being bad, and thus it forces them to play in the half court, and then they get bad because of that. Then their offense isn't good because of that. Bit of a mess. These two things are very interconnected, but when you're like, oh, they're real good at not fouling, yeah, because they ain't providing any resistance, and it's just like Swiss cheese defense, and like, I'll go to the rim, and I'm just going to score. Foul a guy, make him earn it at the free throw line maybe a little bit, and kind of see what potentially could happen. Now, teams are shooting 12th best against New Orleans from the free throw line, which is in stark contrast to them being 27th, but story for another day, and I don't think those are things that you can really control whatsoever, at least on the defensive side of the ball when it comes to that. Opponents making their free throws or not. You can't force them to miss because you can't contest it. Just an interesting stat that I thought kind of shows you, one, my thought process and how I do the show and things I look for, and then kind of like those rabbit holes that are really interesting to go down that tell you about this team where you learn something here, but also why, you can look at some stats and they need those correct context around them because this seems like a great thing. And it's like, no, it's not. This definitely isn't good when you look at the other things it's tied to. Now, if they weren't fouling, but teams were going to the free throw line a bunch, one, how does that happen in the first place? That would be kind of interesting. If they weren't fouling a bunch, but were forcing a bunch of turnovers and then their defense was still where it is, we'd be like, okay, so where's the defense bad because they're good at this sort of thing? Is it defensive rebounding? Is it something else? And that's where we could have gotten into it a little bit more. They're also not a good defensive rebounding team too. So a whole lot going on here with this Pelicans team and on the defensive side of the ball. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Enjoy the game tonight. Doesn't sound like Kevin Durant is going to be played. Kevin Durant is out for the Phoenix Suns. New Orleans maybe gets Brandon Ingram and Herb Jones back. We're going to break it all down in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Jake Madison, your host, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.